I think we will go ahead and get started. We have 32 participants. I'm sure a few others will join us during this introduction. The University of Chicago Press is presenting this event in collaboration with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore as part of our virtual event series by the book, Smart Talk with Chicago Authors. Before we get started, I want to ask everyone to please keep your sound muted throughout the event so that we're not interrupted by background noise. After John Guillory and Nicholas Daines discuss Professing Criticism, we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for a question and answer period. Feel free to put your questions in the chat at any point throughout the event. We will be pulling questions from the chat. I want to mention that Professing Criticism, is available for purchase at the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. You can find a link to purchase the book in the chat. We'll also be sharing a link to the forthcoming new edition of John Guillory's Cultural Capital, which we'll publish in October. That book is available for pre-order now from the Chicago website. So let's get started then. I'm Alan Thomas, editorial director at Chicago, and I had the good luck to work with John Guillory on his 1993 book, Cultural Capital, and on his new book, Professing Criticism. John's new book generated an unusual volume and quality of attention when it was published last winter. Its sociological history of literary studies has arrived at a time when the field's troubles, I think it's fair to say, are especially profound. Why would such a project attract attention in places like the New York Times and the New Yorker? Well, the Chronicle of Higher Education explained this, as well as its own decision to publish 2 reviews of the book, as owing to the fact that literary criticism remains, quote, a potent symbol of intellectual life in the academy. I think one of the best reviews of Professing Criticism to appear so far is Nick Daines' review in the February 21st issue of The Nation. One of the best, I think, because in part, it gave a very subtle account of the continuities between the 1993 book, Cultural Capital, and Professing Criticism. Now that the dust has settled from the initial reception of Professing Criticism, we thought it would be a good idea to bring Nick and John together for this conversation. So to back up and make some proper introductions, John Guillory is Emeritus Professor of English at New York University. His first book, published in 1983 by Columbia, was Poetic Authority, Spencer, Milton, and Literary History. He followed this in 1993 with Cultural Capital, The Problem of Literary Canon Formation. Then in December, the University of Chicago Press brought out Professing Criticism, Essays on the Organization of Literary Study. A new edition of Cultural Capital with an introduction by Merve Emery is forthcoming this October. Nicholas Daines is the Theodore Kahan Professor of Humanities in the Department of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia. He is the author of 3 books. The latest is entitled The Chapter, a segmented history from antiquity to the 21st century. That's forthcoming from Princeton this fall. Daines' articles and essays have appeared in such publications as The Atlantic, N+1, New Left Review, The New Yorker, New York Times Book Review, and Public Books, where he is co-editor-in-chief. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Nick Daines to kick off this conversation with John Guillory.
Thank you, Alan. It's a real pleasure to be here. I should say maybe at the outset that John and I really don't know each other personally. That our engagement, I feel like it's been a virtual one over the course of this year, as I was not just reading Professing Criticism, but rereading Cultural Capital and spending my year to a large extent in just trying to assess where the profession stands right now. So, because of that, John, I want to ask you a question about how this book came to be first. This is just something that I'm very curious about, and I think really has to bear in a pretty intimate way on actually the arguments the book makes. And I suppose I have two questions. One of which is that it's pretty, it's apparent the book is composed of many different pieces, which I think some of them have already appeared elsewhere. So that it was composed over a stretch of time, right? It wasn't like you were writing this all at once in 6 months. And so this is partly a question about how those pieces were assembled and what you did write to sort of stitch them together. And the other question is, as Alan already alluded to, this is the 30th anniversary of Cultural Capital, and I don't know if that's an accident, or to what extent Cultural Capital was in your mind. To what extent? I want to ask a really naive question, like to what extent this is somehow a sequel, or an updating, or a response, or in some relation, however you want to characterize it, to Cultural Capital.
Right. Those are both good and complicated questions. First of all, with regard to the latter, I felt very strongly when I assembled the book for the press, and it is an assemblage. It wasn't conceived as a monograph or in the distant past. I entertained the notion, as I said, writing a new kind of history of literary study. And that proved to be, I think, quite impossible. If someone does it someday, they're going to be a genius, far greater than I. But I didn't conceive it as a sequel. What happened was that as a result of Cultural Capital, I was often asked to speak, and on very different subjects, or I proposed subjects that weren't directly addressed in Cultural Capital. And so over a period of 30 years, I found that I was intermittently recording my ongoing analysis of the profession. It was changing in many respects, and there are other respects in which it was repeating itself. And so I wanted, I was trying to capture that as I produced the essays that went into Professing Criticism. Some of those essays were efforts to begin this kind of mega sociologically informed history of the profession. And that history had a basic argument which had to do with professionalization, and the professionalization of a discourse that did not exist in a professional form prior to the 1920s and 30s, namely literary criticism. There were a lot of other forms of literary study, some in the university, some not in the university. So it was a very, very complicated picture, and it proved too complicated, as I said, for a monograph or a history of the discipline. So what I did instead, what evolved over that 30 years was a sociological analysis, but one that I was sort of putting together as I went along, and really finally has to be put together by the reader as well. So the book as a book is a little bit of an illusion. It is an assemblage of efforts to understand the long-term history of the profession and its recent history, and to relate the long-term history, which was for nearly 2,000 millennia, pre-professional. It existed elsewhere than in the professional academic sites. And its great transformative moment was its professionalization in the earlier 20th century, and particularly between the wars. So the book as a book was a kind of illusion, or a book in which one might say about it, some assembly was required in order for it to make sense. And I hope that people are able to do this assembly. It's actually proven to be not so easy as I thought or hoped it would be. There are parts of the book that I think are just unassimilable at the moment, and Nick may want to return to this. People have said almost nothing about the conclusion of the book. It's not at the moment readable. I'm hoping eventually it will be readable, because without it, there's a distorted understanding of the argument of the book. Comes across as much more pessimistic than I actually intended it to be, because I don't believe that literary criticism is at an end, though it's certainly very troubled. So the book came together in a piecemeal way, and at the same time, I was working on other things. I have an ongoing interest in the early history of media studies. I wrote an essay in critical inquiry, which had pretty wide circulation on the genesis of the media concept. I've written several essays on I.A. Richards. One of them is coming out soon. The other one I've been working on for 20 years, and I'm still not happy with it. I am interested in Walter J. Ong, in Marshall McLuhan. I'm interested in the literary prehistory of media studies, and by extension in media studies, because you can see from the book, to me, this belongs to the future, the present and the future of literary studies. So I was doing this contemporaneously with, but not incorporated into the book. So the book is a kind of illusion. I think people see me as the author of Cultural Capital, the author of Professing Criticism, as though this were the only things I did in my career. In my earlier career, I wrote for 10 years, almost nonstop, on Milton. I was going to produce the Freudal Marxist interpretation of gender in Milton. So I wrote and published 4 essays on Milton. I didn't collect them into a book, which was very stupid. I always advise my students, don't think of the things you write as anything but chapters in a book, because you won't get any credit for it otherwise. So these are relatively hard to find essays on Milton. So I was doing all these other things. The Professing Criticism was just one of the things that I was doing, and it didn't really come together quickly or easily until very late. I mean, until almost 30 years after Cultural Capital. So obviously it has deep roots in Cultural Capital. But I think the more people read this book, the more they will understand that it's not Cultural Capital. It's not just a sequel to Cultural Capital. I really have tried to update my understanding of the profession, so that it amounts to a current understanding, as well as an attempt to, as well as by necessity, a chronicling of the evolution of the discipline over the last 30 years.
John, I'm tempted to ask you. I won't ask you what has changed in 30 years. Because I suspect that answer would just take too long. So let me ask you a slightly different question, which is picking up on something Alan said, and I think most of the people here are probably aware of, which is the really pretty remarkable reception the book got as far as how many outlets wrote about it. And outlets that wouldn't necessarily be expected to have written about it, given the somewhat difficult, dense subject matter. So part of my question is something like what audience you thought you were writing for here. But let me bracket that question just for a second with I don't know, a kind of thought experiment about this, which is I'm wondering, so much of the book, particularly its opening sections, is, if not a complete history of the discipline of criticism, still not a fairly dense working out of a certain moment that you might say goes from the 1890s to the interwar period at the very least, right?
Mhm.
And my question for you is, and this is really the overall question about who you envisioned as your reader. How well known do you think that history is within the discipline itself? And I'll suggest that I think it's not, but I don't know if you concur with that.
It's not.
And if that means anything about your relation to that history, if there's a reminding function or a restoring function. But it does strike me that I kept thinking bizarrely. I mean, I think bizarrely because this wasn't something that was on the forefront of my consciousness before I read the book.
Mhm.
The thought that kept running through my head was what an oddly amnesiac discipline I exist in.
Yes.
And I kept comparing myself to colleagues in, let's say, history or something where and maybe the grass is always greener, but it did feel like for my historian colleagues, there's a more capacious sense of the discipline's past, more of a sense of connection to it. Whereas I feel like there's a kind of wall erected between now and, I mean, I wouldn't know where to place that wall, but on the other side of that historical wall, it would be hard for me to see the people who existed within departments of English as sharing the same profession that I do. So, I guess I take it that we agree on that there's a general disinterest or disinclination to look at the history of the profession, and I don't know how much that weighed on you as you were writing this and what that means to you.
Oh, it weighed very heavily on me because that was already evident in the reception of cultural capital. So there was a way in which the book could be read casually as really the first chapter.
Mhm.
And some constituencies were interested in the Gray Wordsworth chapters, some other constituencies in the New Critical chapter, other constituencies in the Dumont chapter, and then other constituencies still interested in certain theoretical problems having to do with aesthetics and political economy and their convergence in the 18th century. But these were different constituencies. They weren't the same people who were interested in different chapters of the book. And there was not much effort in the reception of cultural capital to put the essays, and they were essays, they're all long form essays rather than chapters in a conventional monograph. There was very little effort to put those things together and to see the book as having an overarching historical narrative behind it. And the same, unfortunately, is true with Professing Criticism. I think that parts of the book are just not going to be interesting or assimilable by everyone. And so they're going to zero in on crises of the moment, like graduate education and the employment crisis, or world literature in English. But then other parts, like the conclusion, are just not going to be readable right now. There's been very little comment on the conclusion, and we can come back to that because that has been something I've had to take in as a disappointment in the reviews. So again, it's not a monograph. It's you have to do a lot of assembly, and I think it's going to take people time to put the chapters together, some of which are pretty thoroughly scholarly historical, like the chapters on philology and literary history and belles lettres, and others are very much concerned with controversies of the moment, and it's going to be very hard for people to bring those chapters back to the more accessible or stimulating, or at least provocative chapters that address controversies of the moment.
Well, controversies of the moment, and also maybe I'm thinking certain frames of discussion that you may not have thought that the book was going to enter into, or maybe you were aware of it, and the book's attempts to not be inserted into those frames for
Right.
whatever reason didn't work. The one I'm thinking of, I don't want to dwell too much on some of the other pieces about the book, but I might as well. It struck me, and this is, I think, particularly true of Nathan Heller's piece in the New Yorker, apropos of your book, that one of the things that happened, I mean, this is a book that is about the history of, one way to put it would be the history of English departments. Let's put it that way, right?
Right.
And yet, the frame in which English often in the responses to your book has come to mean the humanities, has come to be the metonym for the humanities. And so you are taken as addressing something like the crisis of the humanities. I don't, you do write about the origins of the humanities concept. And I don't know, I'd like you to say a little bit more about that and the extent to which you don't want to engage with that. I have a sense that you are a skeptic of the utility of that way of framing what we do, that we exist as part of the humanities, but also maybe the question of what it means for scholars of English to suddenly become, it seems to me in the wider media, like really the metonym for the humanities, which is a strange position to be in. I don't know how it happened. It sometimes it feels like it may speak to it may flatter us a little bit. But can you say something about the distinction between criticism or English and then the humanities, that broader umbrella that this book keeps getting brought into?
Right. Yeah. I'm not sure from the reviews that I've seen or the conversations that I had. I did a seminar at Yale with a graduate group there, a few weeks ago, and no one asked about that chapter, the humanities. But clearly, one of the things I struggle to get beyond is this metonymic reduction of humanities to English, and the result is that some people read this, read my argument about humanities as an attempt to reduce humanities to history rather than to English or to literary study. And react negatively against that. I mean, Michael Berube, in his recent review, had some problems with what he took to be a bias toward history in my argument about humanities, and his desire to address the present, to study the present rather than history. And documents are fine, but you can do humanities without necessarily doing documents or doing history. So I get that, but I don't want to lose the relation between English and the humanities, English as one discipline within the humanities, which because of the way that I think about the humanities, and I don't want to go into the Panofsky terminology of monument and document here, because it takes too long to explain for those who haven't read the chapter itself. But I do think that English belongs to the humanities without being necessarily the central core discipline of the humanities. I don't want history to be that core discipline either. Because one of the things I wanted to try to show in that chapter on humanities was that the humanities find their subject in what I was calling long time, which was not just past but present and future. That all possible human thoughts, actions, and so forth, that existed within either the actual or potential long time of the human species belong to the humanities. So everything that could be conceived under this dual or recto verso concept of humanities, of documents and monuments, would be considered humanities. That's already a little bit too diffuse, I think, to really answer your question. But I think the Nathan Heller piece in the New Yorker is a good example of the confusion of humanities and English, and the problems that result from that confusion. Obviously, that is an inadequate conception of the humanities that performs that metonymic reduction, and we really should get past that.
Yeah, I want to use one little bit in that Nathan Heller piece to open up to a bigger question for you, which is a dynamic that I've been thinking a lot about this year, having read this book. One of my own colleagues at Columbia basically in that piece made a sort of claim that you can track a correlation between the decline of enrollments, I forget now whether it was across the humanities or just in English, and the decline of democracy. Right now, that one of the things one might say, if you kind of feed that argument back into your book, is that this heads directly into what you're arguing about here, which is a certain kind of I don't know how to, I mean, I don't want to, tell me if I'm paraphrasing you badly, but a kind of overinflated rhetoric of political efficacy that is endemic in the profession, and that you explain as a response to all kinds of material conditions, really though ultimately about the structure of professionalization itself, right? Now, but here's the conjuncture that I've had in my mind all year, and that's been very present for me, which is that, all right, if one agrees that there's the rhetoric of what a scholar of English accomplishes politically can often seem overinflated, overestimated. It turns out that that's not just us doing our own overestimation, that we have, let's say, political antagonists doing who very much agree with our own overinflated estimation of ourselves, who treat us as every bit as much the cultural threat that we think we're a force for cultural hope. And you know, there's this feeling I've had of being locked into a kind of, I don't even know what to call it, like it's either somewhere between a dance and a combat, because the way in which we're treated as a threat seems to, you know, incumbent on us to respond, to defend certain things, and in fact, it ends up being to defend our political efficacy. So it's, I guess I wonder what you would say about that. I mean, you know, everyone here probably has some examples of this. You know, and the most, like the most urgent example would probably be located in the state of Florida right now. But I find myself not at all disagreeing with your analysis of the problem of the political rhetoric of the profession, or the sense of the political potential of what we do. And yet we find ourselves in a situation where, boy, it sure seems like everything in the world is conspiring to make to keep us in that. And, you know, does that make sense? I mean, like, I do wonder what one does with your critique in a moment where it just sure feels like nobody, including the people who dislike us the most, thinks that we don't have political efficacy. Does that make sense?
Right. It does. And this was a moment in your review that I pondered really quickly, because, that the first time I read quickly, I didn't quite get the thrust of the argument. When I went back and considered it more carefully, it struck me as really an important point. But I actually want to push back on it a little bit, because what I see in the present moment is a repetition of culture war, but a repetition with a difference. Because if you go back to culture war, and you know, I'm old enough so that this is my cultural formation of the 1980s and 90s and early 2000s. what you see is culture war that is in fact much more cultural in the academic sense, that is dealing with cultural artifacts that are familiar to us, most familiar to us as cultural artifacts. So the figures who were prominent in prosecuting the culture war at this earlier moment, when canon revision was the main thing on the agenda, figures like Roger Kimball and Alan Bloom and William Bennett and Hilton Kramer, those figures really did straddle the journalistic and academic domain in a way that made them very familiar figures to us, and familiar because they actually were reading our work. The culture war that's taking place now seems to me something really very different. DeSantis and state legislatures all over the country, these politicians want to ban Toni Morrison and even burn her books and all sorts of things of that nature. But it's no longer the case that the prosecutors, the warriors in this culture war, are themselves figures who come out of the cultural domain. They're figures like DeSantis who are political. The state legislators, I think, are probably even more abysmally ignorant about literature, history, and all of the things that concern us in the humanities departments and disciplines in the university. Much more ignorant, certainly, than Roger Kimball or William Bennett. I don't believe these people have read Toni Morrison.
Yeah.
Whereas in the earlier culture war, the people who were saying, why aren't you teaching Shakespeare, had actually read Shakespeare. So they had stakes that were clearly cultural stakes. I question whether the culture war that's going on at the present moment is one in which cultural stakes are central. And the proof of that for me is how easily woke migrated from whatever its origins were, and I'm not sure what those origins really were. It's a little bit of a mystery to me. It's one of those words and movements that seems to come from nowhere. But the figures who are important today, like DeSantis, are not figures who are grounded in cultural matters, in cultural enterprises. And I think they're picking off targets that are easy for them and that don't need to be defended or explained to their constituencies, those who back them. So they haven't read Toni Morrison. The people that they're catering to, that they're trying to get the support of, haven't read Toni Morrison and never will. And the proof of that for me is how easily someone like DeSantis slips over from critical race studies and Toni Morrison and tendencies like that in the university to woke culture in the Disney Corporation. He's looking for targets, and he goes for those targets wherever he finds them. So I'm not really sure that our advocacy of Toni Morrison and figures like that, who at one time constituted occasions in culture war, Toni Morrison versus Shakespeare, as though that were ever the choice. Yeah. At one time, that was the way the battle was fought in culture war. Now it's not Toni Morrison versus Shakespeare. Yeah. It's the danger of critical racism, a critical race theory, and Black Lives Matter, and people like DeSantis just go for anything connected with that. So I question whether the cultural is actually the center, rather than something that's absorbed into a culture war that goes really now very much beyond the cultural. It's cultural war of a sort, but the targets are much bigger, much more broadly based socially, much less about us than I think maybe we think that culture war is about.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? I think I agree that it is, we're almost on the order of like ancillary targets or collateral targets, but also, and yet at the same time, it feels so fundamental. So it's a, but I won't, I mean, I suppose one way to follow up is to take you up on your invitation earlier to think about what was sometimes read as the book's, I think you used the word pessimism. I might say something like the book's elegiac, supposedly elegiac quality, as if in describing, I mean, you have this term called the post-war settlement, which is meant to describe the sort of normal science and normal functioning of literature departments from the end of World War II to, I mean, you would know better than I do when you would place an end to that moment, but as if just the very act of naming it and describing it and would have to be elegiac, right? Like that would have to be the reason one does that, is to mourn its loss. And yet at other moments, I mean, the book is very clear about saying something, you know, which seems to run counter to supposed elegy, which is that there's a great deal of hope for intellectual life of criticism outside of the profession.
Yes.
Or at least in some very, very altered state of the profession. And I guess I want to ask you about the relative proportion of elegy and hope here, or if it's even fair to say that there's any elegy here. You might have intended this as much more neutrally historical or even sociological, but it got read as, you know, you cannot describe what the profession was like in 1965 without in some sense elegizing it. I don't see that in the book, but others did, and so I'm curious how you would respond to that.
I think that's probably the reading, or from my perspective, misreading of the book that most concerns me, because it's also, just to a certain extent, a repetition of the misreading of cultural capital. Cultural capital is often read crudely, converted into the right-wing narrative in which supposedly I was against canon revision, which was simply not true. And I practice all the time canonical revision in my courses. So there's no, it's not something I'm against, but it somehow came across as that. But in the analogous misreading from my perspective, and others will have to decide whether it's really a misreading and maybe it's something that's really there. I understand the perception of an elegiac tone, although I'm only nostalgic about that aspect of the post-war settlement, which enabled a lot of good and interesting criticism. But I do think that there was something in the post-war settlement that was exhaustible. It's not an inexhaustible solution, and it became repetitious. And I was very much a high theory maven in the 70s and 80s in my cultural formation, and adopted a lot of that language myself, and don't really regret that. But elegy and pessimism are a little bit different. Pessimism edges elegy over into something that's really culpable, that's really, capable of being criticized for potentially harmful effects in reception. And I do want to push back pretty strongly against the notion of my tone in the book, or my agenda in the book, as pessimistic. and yet it was read that way. All of the titles of the reviews go right for the existential question: is this the
Is
end
this
of
the end?
literary
Yeah.
studies?
Yeah.
Is Guillory saying that this is the end of literary studies? Actually, I'm not saying that, and that's the conclusion does not say that by any means. The existential question is a question that needs to be answered, and that's how I posed it in the book. I didn't pose it as the existential fate of the discipline. So I would put that forward as a response. Definitely, I really wanted to reaffirm what I thought were immemorial rationales for literary study that continued into the present and presumably can continue into the future as well. But nonetheless, I wasn't offering anything programmatic in the book that could be at all received as cheerleading what we do and congratulating us for doing it well. And so the absence of that was read as pessimism, when to me it was just realism in the ordinary language sense of realism. I was just describing what I think was the case, happened to be the case. So we respond in the discipline very, very much to the moment, to Black Lives Matter, attacks from the right wing, and so forth. And there was an expectation, I think, that I was going to address that, and didn't.
Mm-hmm.
So that was conceived. That was regarded as just throwing up my hands and saying the discipline is really at an end. What I was saying was that the public-facing rhetoric of justification was not working for us. We had two crises to deal with: an external crisis of funding and public support, and we had an internal crisis in which literary study was becoming balkanized. It was, breaking up into all of these individual subfields, like eco-criticism and animal studies and disability studies and so forth. What was holding all that together? The public-facing rhetoric wasn't doing a particularly good job at bringing these things together, and it seemed that, or it can seem to those outside the discipline, that we didn't really have a justification aside from these individual subfield agendas, and that's not a good thing. That's not strategic. It doesn't mean that the problems in the discipline, the decline of the discipline, just in terms of numbers, was our fault. It meant that there was a question about the relation between the external pressures of defunding and public support and the internal, what I was calling crisis of legitimation, about how these two things were related and how they might be better related. Now, I will admit, I don't think I did a particularly good job at relating these two things, at showing how a better public-facing justification of what we do might respond in a good way to the external crisis of funding and public support. So I don't know yet how to do that, but I recognize it as a fault of the book. And it, that chicken has come home to roost, and I'm living with it. It's an unhappily gawky little creature, yapping at me or whatever. Sorry to get carried away with that metaphor. But the other thing, I have a couple of other thoughts about that. One is that whether we realize it or not, we've bought into an economics of growth in the discipline that's just everywhere around us. Growth is everything, everywhere. If something is succeeding, it's growing. If it's failing, it's contracting. And I wonder now whether it's been a mistake for us to sort of unwittingly and uncritically accept that an economics of growth should be something that we are invested in. So I wonder if there's a metric that doesn't really depend upon growth, that looks at the decline in numbers as something that is perhaps inevitable. Numbers of all sorts: amount of money we get, amount of students taking our courses as majors, and so amount of tenure lines that we get. It is the measure of the success of the profession its growth? Is the measure of the failure of the profession the decrease in those numbers? Is there any other way to think about the success or the failure of the profession? I don't know. I raised this as a question. I haven't thought enough about it, had enough time really to think about it. I wonder, for example, taking the long view, whether we're in the position of the study of Greek and Latin in the 19th century. Can we say about the study of Greek and Latin, not only that they failed to dominate the university in the way that they had for millennia, but when they transition, as they also did, to departments, to disciplines, to the profession, was this not a victory of sorts? Was this not something that was good in itself? It allowed the study of Greek and Latin to continue. And this is what I think we might think about. What will allow us to continue to do what we do without measuring our success or failure by a metric of numbers? So that's just, I raised that just as a question. And then the other, and we might use it as a transition, Nick, because I know you wanted to, well, I wanted you to talk about this question, but you may not want to talk about it. I was just so impressed by it. Is it the case that, what I was calling the semi-autonomous professional sphere, is it the case that this is really where the future of the discipline lies, with the filtering out, the drifting out into the internet public sphere of all of those, not all, but some, unfortunately, a very significant number of graduate students who are not going to get tenure track jobs, but who have found a place where they can continue to be critics. And indeed, not only just not only critics in the sense of the professional critic, but in the sense of the critic much more closely resembling the critic of the 19th century. That is a critic who is self-authorized, who is finding his or her own audience, and it isn't situated where all of the rituals of professionalism, the tenure track, the advancement up the ranks, and so forth, those things are irrelevant. You had a really good way of talking about this as the lateral reorganization of literary studies. So it sprawled across the internet laterally as forms of association that didn't have the hierarchical structure of academia. So the question is that a good thing? Is that the future of the discipline? I want the discipline to continue as an academic discipline, but obviously we have a problem in staffing it such that it continues to thrive as an academic discipline. So am I getting? I'm trying to.
No, you are, and I would happily expand on that question for a very long time.
Good thing you went for a very long time. So have I.
yes,
Yeah. I mean,
I know Alan has questions, has at least a couple of questions queued up from the audience. So Alan, maybe I'll let you turn to one of those.
Sure. We might hold John's question to you in reserve. If we have a minute at the end, you could return to it. But there's a good question here from Simon Reeder. Could you share your thoughts about the history and place of creative writing in English departments? He mentions that it was absent from the book, and he's curious what you, John, think of it as a field within English departments, as it now often is, and somewhere between literary study and rhetoric and composition. What are your thoughts?
Right. Yeah. My thoughts on the subject are very inchoate. I take my cue to a certain extent from Mark McGurl's work on creative writing, to some extent continued in the most recent book, which I think is really important, on the novel in the Age of Amazon. I don't know what I think about it. On the one hand, it seems to me the triumph of a kind of ephemeralization of literary writing. On the other hand, it also has some kind of importance as a continuation of literature, a continuation of the establishment of a literary culture. And though a lot of this literary culture doesn't look very impressive from the point of view of academia, from the point of view of our fancy monographs and essays in literary journals, and in fact, we don't really write about most of this literary writing. We just don't find enough there to write about. So we write about it in the aggregate in the way that Mark McGurl has written about it. But I don't know what the relation of creative writing is going to be to academic literary study. It doesn't seem to me necessarily an academic enterprise. It has become one. The literary, we could do it in the same way that we do art schools. It could be completely apart from the academy, but creative writing has become a huge part of academic, of the way in which academia deals with literature, not critically, but from the point of view of production. And what does one say about this? My colleagues think of this. I'm talking about my department, but I'm hearing this from so many departments as the salvation of the English department. I think that's a really dangerous way to think about it, because then we have no way of judging, of determining what is the relation between creative writing and the scholarly study of literature. How do you relate those things to one another? They take place at the same time, in the same classrooms, as adjacent enterprises, which don't necessarily have much to do with each other at all. So I tried to think with my colleagues, my wonderful colleagues like Maureen McLean, how do we bring these two enterprises into some closer relation, so that we don't have to think of this as just a way of acquiring majors in our disciplines, by virtue of the fact that they can also be creative writers, by virtue of the fact that they can do a creative writing minor. I think that's makeshift. I think that's a temporary patch-up solution. I think we're waiting for a longer-term solution to this problem, if it's a problem. But I don't have the solution. It's a big hole in the book, and it's been pointed out to me. You say nothing about creative writing. Creative writing is the future of the discipline. I've been told that many times, almost as though, the academic study of literature is pretty much over. Those people are much more down on the future of literary study than I am. But I've been told this, it's over. Creative writing is the future. I don't know what to say about that.
Yeah, this is one of those areas where I think it would do, just for what it's worth, it would do well for people looking at the literary studies profession to examine other areas of the humanities, because
Right.
you have professors of practice in music departments,
Yeah.
in art and architecture departments, and religious studies is another very interesting case, because departments of religion often have ministry programs in them, and the relationship between theology and secularized religious studies has a lot to teach the rest of the humanities about professionalization. At any rate, we have a question I'm glad someone has asked from Jesse Mosqueda about what advice you have, John, for students who are considering careers in literary study. If the future of the discipline is not in the academy, what is the future of the PhD in English? Should students consider it anymore? In a nutshell, what's your advice to graduate students?
Okay, that's the hardest question yet.
Yeah.
My advice is always, except for very, very few students, don't go to graduate school. That it's a huge risk, a personal risk, a risk of your, economic well-being, your happiness, the satisfaction in your work. It's a huge risk. So I'm not sure that I have beyond that any really good advice. I have found, I will just say very, very frankly, and perhaps I'll get into trouble for this, but I found it increasingly difficult to teach graduate students, to teach graduate seminars in the past few years, because you sort of feel this wash of anger and resentment over you, and it's very hard to deal with. And if you feel the bad faith of the enterprise of producing MAs and PhDs who are not going to get jobs, or even worse, who are going to be stuck in the adjunct professoriate, where they'll be brutally exploited. So there's the profession is in a very bad state right now, with these unresolved problems, many of which are not our fault. They've been handed to us by the gradual conversion by the administration of tenure track faculty into casualized faculty. I don't see any hope for changing this without just massive unionization of adjunct faculty. Not so much graduate student unions. I think graduate student unions are important, but I think they have potentially much less effect than adjunct unions in pressing the university to at least start shrinking the distance. And it has happened in some places. I mean, the California system is much advanced over much the rest of the country, to bring contract labor into greater parity with tenure track labor. And then, of course, the closer that parity becomes, the more it becomes a question of, well, why do we have the distinction at all? And why can't we all just be either tenure track or contract? It seems more likely that we'll go. Some systems will go the way that Texas is going now, and just everyone is contract labor. If they manage to pass, the revocation of tenure, it's not a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing at all. And yet, greater parity between the adjunct professoriate and the tenure track professoriate is a good thing. So I don't think that this is a great moment to enter the profession, unfortunately. And I've had to say this to people I would ordinarily have, 30 years ago, 40 years ago, I would have said, sure, sure, yeah, give it a shot. It isn't guaranteed to succeed, but it's certainly worth a shot. Now I just feel tremendously burdened with guilt by reinforcing decisions among seniors and people who are interested in going to graduate school, getting a PhD, spending all that time, all that money, and not at the end having the careers they really wanted. Now the flip side of that, not the flip side, but the unintended effect of that is what Nick was pointing out about the chapter on graduate education, that what this has produced has been this burgeoning internet sphere of semi-autonomous professionals, one foot in academia, one foot in the internet world, where they can be critics, but they can't have any of the professional advantages of being an academic literate critic, a career with an upwardly mobile career track, and all of that. That's to be found in academia. But they have, by contrast, a certain kind of freedom from the constraints of academia. They don't have to write in the genres of the scholarly essay with all the apparatus, the footnotes, and so forth. So what's happening is very strange, an accommodation to the very thing that inclines me to say, no, don't go to graduate school. Yet when people do, they contribute to what I call the building out of this semi-professional sphere. Anyway, Nick, what do you think about this? Because you have any further thought about this? Because you put it, I think, so much better than I did in the book in your review.
Well, John, I mean, actually, to be honest, what I would say, to go back to the original question, what does one say to a student who asks about getting a PhD?
Mm-hmm.
I've actually found your vocabulary or the way you set it up in the book very, very helpful, because it allowed me, what I would say, and I think it's such a tricky position for so many ethical reasons, right?
Yeah.
Have a response to that. But what I would say, to be as neutrally sociological as I could, I would say, well, what one has to realize, and this I got from your book, something snapped into place for me when I read that chapter of yours. What you have to understand is that a PhD program is a job of its own. It has now become, it is not an apprenticeship. It is not a passage through to something else. It now is a job of its own, with its own, its own very specific demands.
Right.
And like any job of its own, the question would have to be a kind of cost-benefit analysis that would play very differently depending on the profile of the student you're talking to.
Right.
There are a lot of students who will say things that I think cannot be denied. Yes, I understand it's a job of its own. It's a job that lasts 5 to 6 years and provides me with health insurance, potentially dental insurance, provides me with potentially a place to live in, in an area I do want to live in. There are real gains to that. I can't prejudge. I no longer feel capable of prejudging the ultimate, where that takes you. But I think that at least starting from the position that this is now actually defines its own job sphere, as odd as that might sound, that seems to be where we've landed. That doesn't, John, I agree, that doesn't do away with the potential forms of resentment about what might happen after that. It doesn't do away with it at all, but at least it helps clarify the situation to simply say up front, this is a job, which is certainly nothing that would have been said to me when I entered a PhD program at all.
Right.
And B, that it is, like any job, one has to investigate, one has to think very hard about the benefits, one has to think about the remuneration. And one really can't say where that job takes you.
Right.
Afterwards. I mean, that would be the starting point of an answer for me. It would be to say, well, graduate education now is not, in some ways, is not odd as this is, it's not education as you might think of it, right? It's a job. It always was, right? But that aspect, the way that aspect appeared, the rewards of it were, the proportion of to say it always was a job actually obscures a lot of fundamental changes that have happened recently. So that would be the starting point of my answer. And where one goes from there would have to be based on that kind of, I think, pretty clear-eyed reality about it.
Right. There are 2 points I would make about that. I agree with everything you said. The first is that in my experience, graduate students who have their foot in both fields and quite productively in both fields, good graduate students who also work in with internet blogs and internet magazines and so forth, and do really interesting work in that domain as well. They still want the academic job. Because they could still do the internet stuff, but what they want is the career. What they still want is the career, the upward mobility, the salary, the relations with academic peers and students, the teaching, all that. So it's not a question of the one thing just taking the place of the other. It doesn't.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, it's the lateral organization also means that it doesn't conform to the professional job, to the professional career. It's something else. Something else.
Yeah, I think, John, you actually cited in that chapter Christine Smallwood's novel, The Life of the Mind, which, to go back to an earlier question you were asked, I mean, is really interesting just at the level, again, of the kind of sociology of the professions, because the book itself, I mean, in a sense, the writer, the subject of the book, who was a graduate student and an adjunct, becomes a creative writer, right? Like the novel is the outcome of graduate education.
Right.
And the all the ways in which that is a victory and not a victory get investigated in that novel.
Exactly.
So, to think about the relation between creative writing and graduate education, well, that would be a great, that's a really, for me, almost like a primary document to think about how that happens right now.
Right. Yeah, it would be interesting to have Christine Smallwood at this moment in our conversation.
Yes.
Then the question is, well, was it worth it, sort of exiting academia to become a novelist? Well, maybe some figures who do that might not succeed in the way that Christine Smallwood at the present moment has succeeded in producing this, I think, quite significant book, but really about that straddling of these two worlds. And the other point I would make is that it's useful, I think, to think about an analogous trajectory for a profession like medicine, which also has a period of hyper-exploitation, residency, lots of resident physicians are not fully, they haven't acceded to their full professorial or doctoral identities quite yet. But imagine if the vast majority of them, or the greater majority of them, ended their careers at that point at which they had served out their residency. How many of them would go into medicine to have that job, that that temporary career, knowing that they would, for the most part, most of them exit it. In the humanities, many of our students do go into this temporary career, knowing that it will be a temporary career. And how we feel about this, I think I have so many mixed feelings about it. It's just not.
Well, right. I mean, if anything, one thing I've learned in having some of these discussions is that there's, you know, what can I say? In the contemporary professional landscape as a whole, it becomes very hard to imagine one's eventual employment history as anything but a series of temporary accommodations.
Yep.
And if that is the, you know, that precarity isn't imagined any longer, you know, as a temporary condition one fights through, but a lifelong condition. And
right.
in that scenario, the temporariness of graduate school does look a bit different, bizarrely. So I you know, I'm sorry to raise that, but we're reaching, speaking of pessimism, I'm reaching a new level of pessimism myself here, thinking about that. But I will say, just the last thing I'll say about this, I have found that the state of, again, the state of pessimism in relation to graduate education that I felt 5-7 years ago now feels oddly different. If only because the ambient situation has worsened to the point that 5 to 6 years in a graduate program can sometimes seem like a temporary haven. And I don't know whether I really do not know how to feel about that, and how to act in the light of that. But that's been a shift I've noted.
I felt that too. Although I've also seen that as compatible with a feeling of anger.
Yeah, sure.
And then both of those things can be true.
Yes. Yes. No, absolutely. It is a haven. And why do I need a haven? Why only a haven? I mean, these are really, really urgent questions to ask, and one completely understands the nature of them. The only other thing I'll add to this is that, of course, John, you opened up this territory in that chapter in your book, that, of course, one of the pursuits that opens up, for reasons that were not certainly not intentional on anyone's part, that opens up in the course of a lot of people's graduate educations is the horizon of labor organizing. And so that as a kind of interesting Knight's move that has opened up also has to be taken into account here, but in a way that I don't myself know how to think through, or how that would impact the way I advise people.
Yeah, there isn't labor organizing, at least so far as I know, on the internet. And when people do blogs and so forth, the employment structure is so loose and so singular. With few exceptions like LARB and N+1, where you do have a collectivity of workers and a product that actually gets sold, that can actually be sold. Although I'm sure it doesn't generate a huge amount of income or provide easy financial security for those involved in it. But nonetheless, we're looking at a labor landscape and an ecosystem of intellectual labor that's really different from what went before, and we just don't have a sense of its future, and we don't have a sense of how to provide these generations of young people who want an intellectual life, and thank God they do, because we want that to continue, but we don't know how to provide them with plausible economic and employment lives to make that possible for them. So yes, the unionization is a good part of it, but you don't see that on the internet. Unionize about what? It's very if someone's writing a standalone blog, what are they going to unionize?
Well, it is the opportunity is obviously harder, when you exit a scenario where you are within a collectivity that can unionize into a freelance existence.
Exactly.
That's much more could potentially much more atomizing, although I never want to discount the possibilities for different kinds of collectivity that might emerge, but in a lot of ways not yet there.
Yeah. Well, one of the questions that I'm interested in is whether internet sites will start aggregating, and will it be possible for public intellectuals to emerge from that aggregation? But that's another question than the question of unionization, but still related to the problem of collectivity. The university provides, but the internet doesn't quite. So yes, and Alan tells me that we should be wrapping up. So
Yes.
We probably should. We were meant to end 18 minutes ago, but I noticed that our audience has been sticking with us, so we wanted to go ahead and let this go a little longer. There was a question about ChatGPT, which, John, you may be grateful that we're going to have to skip over. I had hoped we could return to the problem of your book's coda, which you mentioned you were disappointed had not been taken up. As your editor, I take some of the blame because I let you title it in Latin.
all right.
It might have been better titled a plan of study than Ratio Studiorum.
Right.
But for those curious about the more programmatic conclusion of the book, please buy a copy, ideally from the Seminary Co-op bookstore if you don't have a copy of Professing Criticism yet. The link is in our chat. And I will close by thanking all of you for joining us, and thanking especially John Guillory and Nicholas Dames for this terrific conversation. This is being recorded, and those who missed part of it will find it in a few days, I imagine, on the University of Chicago Press YouTube channel. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, John. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, John. Thank you,
John.
Meredith. Behind the scenes, Meredith Nini.
Yes.
Pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Yeah. Great to see you both.
Good to see you both.
Bye-bye.
Alan, do you want us to stick around, or are we done?
We are done. I'm going slow so that you can see all the thanks in the chat, but let's go ahead and sign off and see you again soon.
All right, John. Well, I'll be in touch with you, John, fairly soon, because we have another event.
For the next event. Yeah. This was a good setup. I enjoyed it.
It was. There's a lot of places still to go, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right.
Okay.
Take care.
Folks. Thanks, folks.
Bye-bye.